March 1945. A column of American half-tracks rumbled through the shattered streets of a German village just west of the Rhine River. The lead vehicle, an M3 personnel carrier belonging to the Third Armored Infantry Battalion, carried 13 men in full combat gear. Behind it stretched a line of similar vehicles that disappeared into the morning haze, dozens of them, then hundreds, moving with mechanical precision toward the river crossings. A German Oberst, a colonel in what remained of the Wehrmacht, watched this procession from the window of a makeshift interrogation room. He had been captured 2 days earlier during the American breakthrough near Koblenz. Now, as an American intelligence officer questioned him about defensive positions, the German officer's attention kept drifting to the endless stream of half-tracks passing outside. The American captain noticed his distraction. "Something interesting out there, Colonel." The German officer gestured toward the window. "How many of these vehicles do you possess?" The captain shrugged. "Enough." The German colonel shook his head slowly, not in defiance but in something closer to despair. "We were told these were inferior machines, poorly armoured, mechanically unreliable, simple trucks with tracks attached." He paused, watching another dozen half-tracks roll past. "When will they stop coming?" The American captain almost smiled. "They won't." This conversation, recorded in a Third Army intelligence summary from March 1945, captures a psychological turning point that had been building for years. German military planners had spent the war dismissing American half-tracks as crude compromises, examples of unsophisticated American engineering that valued quantity over quality. They had laughed at intelligence photographs showing these boxy vehicles with their open tops and simple construction. They had produced detailed technical analyses proving the superiority of their own SD-KFZ-2, 151 Hanomag half-tracks with their complex interleaved road wheels and sloped armour. They had done everything except account for one critical factor. America had built over 41,000 of these machines. Germany had built 15,000 of theirs. And now, in the spring of 1945, that numerical reality was rolling across the Rhine into the heart of the Third Reich, a mechanized tide that no amount of German technical sophistication could stop. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the American half-track begins not with triumph, but with pragmatism bordering on desperation. In late 1939, as German panzers demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of mechanized warfare in Poland, the United States Army faced an uncomfortable truth. The American military was not mechanized. It was not even close. Most American infantry divisions still relied on horses and wagons for transport. The few armoured units that existed used a hodgepodge of vehicles, many of them obsolete or borrowed from civilian production. American planners studied the German blitzkrieg tactics with growing alarm. The Germans had developed specialized half-track vehicles, the SD-KFZ series, specifically designed to allow infantry to keep pace with advancing tanks. These vehicles featured continuous tracks at the rear for cross-country mobility and wheels at the front for steering. The concept was not new. The French had experimented with half-tracks in the 1920s, but the Germans had refined the design into an effective combat system. The American response emerged from an unlikely source. In late 1925, the United States Army had purchased several Citroën Kégresse half-tracks from France for evaluation as artillery tractors. These civilian vehicles performed adequately in tests, but were too small and underpowered for serious military use. The design languished until 1938 when the Army Ordnance Department, recognizing the growing threat of mechanized warfare, initiated a new program to develop an American half-track. The prototype that emerged in 1939, designated the T-14, was essentially a marriage of convenience. Engineers took a White Scout Car M3 chassis, a vehicle already in limited production, and mated it to a version of the Kégresse half-track suspension system. The resulting vehicle looked crude. It was crude, but it worked. In 1940, as German forces overran France and demonstrated the overwhelming effectiveness of mechanized infantry, the Army standardized the design as the half-track Car M2. The M2 was intended primarily as an artillery tractor, capable of towing light howitzers and carrying the gun crew and ammunition. But American planners quickly recognized that the basic design could be adapted for other roles. In late 1940, they lengthened the hull by 10 inches, reconfigured the interior layout, and created the half-track personnel carrier M3. This vehicle could carry a driver and 12 soldiers, a full infantry squad, along with their equipment and weapons. Production began in May 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor would bring America into the war. The M3 that rolled off assembly lines in Toledo, Detroit, and other American cities was not a sophisticated machine. The hull was a simple box of welded and riveted steel plate. The front armor, 10 mm thick, could stop small arms fire and shrapnel but nothing heavier. The sides were even thinner, just 6 mm. The top was completely open, covered only by a canvas tarp that provided no ballistic protection whatsoever. The vehicle rode on 2 large rubber tires at the front and continuous rubber-coated steel tracks at the rear. The tracks were supported by a vertical volute, spring suspension system, simpler and more maintainable than the complex interleaved road wheels used on German designs. Power came from a white 160AX engine, a 6-cylinder gasoline engine, displacing 386 cubic inches and producing 148 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. This was a modified version of an engine already in production for commercial trucks. Nothing about it was specialized or exotic. The engine was deliberately designed with loose tolerances, which actually made it more reliable under combat conditions when precise maintenance was impossible. The transmission was a 4-speed manual, with a 2-speed transfer case for the tracks. A soldier could learn to drive an M3 in a few hours. Maintaining it required only basic mechanical skills and common hand tools. The M3's specifications told the story of American design philosophy in stark terms. Length, 20 feet, 3 inches. Width, 7 feet, 3.5 inches. Height with windshield up, 7 feet, 5 inches. Weight, approximately 9 tons fully loaded. Ground clearance, 10 inches. The 60-gallon fuel tank gave a range of roughly 220 miles on roads, considerably less cross-country. Top speed approached 45 miles per hour on paved surfaces, though most drivers kept it closer to 30 for safety. Armament consisted of a single 50-caliber M2 heavy machine gun mounted on a pedestal at the front of the passenger compartment, supplemented by 1 or 2 30-caliber M1919 machine guns on skate rails along the sides. This was defensive armament only. The M3 was not designed to slug it out with enemy tanks or assault fortified positions. It was a battle taxi, meant to transport infantry to the fight, provide some protection from small arms fire during the approach, and then let the soldiers dismount to do their real work on foot. German intelligence officers who first examined photographs of the M3 in early 1942 found little to impress them. One report from the Wehrmacht's intelligence service, the Abwehr, described the American vehicle as appearing hastily assembled with little regard for engineering refinement. The assessment was not entirely wrong. The M3 was hastily assembled. American manufacturers were churning them out at a rate that prioritized production speed over elegant engineering. Another German analysis from mid-1942 noted the M3's open top as a critical vulnerability. The lack of overhead protection makes this vehicle unsuitable for operations in artillery zones, the report concluded. Crews will suffer unacceptable casualties from airburst shells. This assessment proved partially correct. American soldiers did suffer casualties from overhead artillery fire in their half-tracks. They gave the vehicles the grim nickname, Purple Heart Boxes, a reference to the decoration awarded for combat wounds. But the assessment missed something crucial. The Americans had already calculated those casualties into their operational planning and determined that the increased mobility and firepower the half-tracks provided more than compensated for their vulnerabilities. German officers had confidence in their own half-track, the SD Kfz 251. Developed in 1938 and entering production in 1939, the 251 represented German engineering at what they considered its finest. The vehicle featured sloped armor plates for improved ballistic protection, reaching 15 mm thickness at critical points. The complex Schachtelaufwerk suspension system used overlapping and interleaved road wheels, similar to those on the Tiger and Panther tanks, which lowered ground pressure and provided excellent traction. The vehicle's long tracks gave it superb cross-country mobility, better than the American design in deep mud or snow. The armor layout was more sophisticated, the mechanical design more refined. German technical documents from 1942 directly compared the SDKFZ 251 to the American M3, concluding that the German vehicle was superior in virtually every measurable category. Better armor protection, better cross-country mobility, better designed for its role as a combat infantry vehicle. The only category where the M3 showed an advantage was mechanical simplicity, which German engineers dismissed as unimportant. A properly trained Wehrmacht mechanic, they argued, could maintain the more complex German vehicle without difficulty. This confidence would prove tragically misplaced, not because German engineers had miscalculated the technical specifications. The 251 was indeed the more sophisticated machine. German confidence would collapse under the weight of something that no amount of technical sophistication could overcome: industrial capacity. The first American half-tracks reached combat zones in late 1941 when the M2 and early M3 models were shipped to the Philippines. When Japanese forces invaded in December 1941, the small number of American half-tracks present performed adequately in the desperate fighting, but they were far too few to make a difference. The real test came in North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, brought American forces into direct contact with Axis troops for the first time. Thousands of M3 half-tracks landed with the invasion force. German and Italian soldiers got their first close look at the vehicles Americans had been producing by the thousands. The initial German assessment was dismissive, but wary. Captured intelligence reports from early 1943 acknowledged the M3's speed and cross-country mobility, but criticized what observers saw as wasteful overproduction. One report noted that American armored divisions seemed to have unlimited numbers of these vehicles, suggesting logistics excess rather than tactical necessity. The Americans produce these simple vehicles in quantities that exceed operational requirements, the analysis stated. This reflects industrial capacity without corresponding strategic thinking. At German headquarters in Tunisia, officers examining their first captured M3 in January 1943 found much to criticize. The armor was inadequate. The open top was a vulnerability. The mechanical design was unsophisticated. But one item caught their attention. Stenciled on the dashboard was the vehicle's serial number, W4,032,891. 4 million. The German officers discussed what this number might mean. Perhaps American numbering systems did not correspond to actual production figures. Perhaps the number included components or subassemblies. The alternative, that America had actually produced over 4 million military vehicles in less than 2 years of war, seemed impossible. The fighting in North Africa gradually revealed a pattern that would repeat across every theatre of the war. German forces often won individual tactical engagements. Their tanks were frequently superior, their anti-tank guns more effective. But they could never concentrate enough forces to win decisive victories because American material superiority kept overwhelming local German advantages. American units that took heavy losses received replacement vehicles within days. German units that suffered similar losses sometimes waited months for replacements that never arrived. The M3 played a crucial role in this disparity. American armored divisions in North Africa fieloped using a triangular structure with 3 armored infantry battalions, each equipped with 54 M2 and M3 half-tracks. This gave divisional commanders enormous flexibility. Infantry could move at tank speeds, keep pace with armor during exploitation, and deploy rapidly when encountering resistance. German panzer divisions in North Africa followed different organization. A typical panzer division included 4 panzer grenadier battalions, mechanized infantry units that theoretically rode in half-tracks, but in practice Only one of those 4 battalions usually possessed SDKFZ 251 vehicles. The other 3 battalions rode in trucks, which meant they could not keep pace with tanks during mobile operations and could not safely traverse areas under artillery fire. This organizational reality, driven by production limitations, created a fundamental tactical disadvantage. German armor often had to wait for truck-mounted infantry to catch up or advance, without infantry support and risk ambush. American armor faced no such constraints. When the North African campaign ended in May 1943, with the surrender of German forces in Tunisia, over 250,000 Axis soldiers entered captivity. German officers in prisoner of war camps discussed their experiences with American equipment. Many admitted grudging respect for American logistics and production capacity. The half-track became a symbol of this respect, not because it was sophisticated, but because it was everywhere. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 brought more American half-tracks to the Mediterranean theatre. By now, the M3 had received several modifications based on combat experience. Improved suspension springs handled rough terrain better. Spring-loaded rear idler wheels replaced the fixed idlers that had been breaking in North Africa. Mine racks were added to the exterior, allowing units to carry additional explosives. Interior grab handles were installed to help soldiers steady themselves during cross-country movement. Removable armored headlight assemblies protected the lights from small arms fire. None of these modifications fundamentally changed the vehicle's capabilities. They simply made it more reliable and easier to use. This focus on incremental improvement rather than radical redesign reflected American production philosophy. Keep the basic design stable so production lines could maintain high output rates. Implement only those modifications that clearly improved reliability or reduced casualties. Never stop production to wait for the perfect solution. The Italian campaign, beginning with the invasion of Sicily and continuing up the peninsula through 1944, provided yet more evidence of the value of mechanized mobility. Italian terrain, with its mountains, valleys, and countless streams, should have favored defenders. And it did, to an extent. German forces fought skillful delaying actions, making the Allies pay heavily for every mile of advance. But American mechanized infantry in their half-tracks could redeploy rapidly when German defenses strengthened, shifting to exploit weaknesses elsewhere. The M3's cross-country mobility, while inferior to the German 251 in the worst terrain, was more than adequate for the majority of Italian roads and trails, and there were always enough American half-tracks to keep infantry moving wherever tanks could go. By mid-1944, German intelligence had abandoned any pretense that the M3 was an inferior vehicle. The numbers told a story that no amount of technical sophistication could refute. Reports from the Eastern Front described Soviet forces using American-supplied half-tracks under the Lend-Lease program. Reports from Italy documented entire American divisions equipped with these vehicles. And intelligence from France, as the Allies prepared for the inevitable invasion, suggested that American forces would bring thousands more half-tracks across the English Channel. In June 1944, Operation Overlord brought the full weight of American industrial power to bear on Fortress Europe. The Normandy invasion included waves of landing ships, disgorging M3 half-tracks onto the beaches. Some drowned in the surf, some burned on the beach under German artillery fire. But more kept coming. Within days, American armored divisions were breaking out of the beachhead, and their half-track mounted infantry was keeping pace with the tanks. The bocage country of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, should have negated the advantages of mechanization. German defenders used the terrain brilliantly, turning every field into a potential killing zone. But American forces adapted. Engineers welded steel teeth cut from German beach obstacles onto the front of tanks, allowing them to bull through hedgerows. Half-tracks followed, bringing infantry through the gaps. The German army's experience fighting against American half-tracks in Normandy crystallized a terrible realization that had been building since North Africa. The issue was not whether the SDKFZ 251 was technically superior to the M3. It was, The issue was that Germany faced enemies who could afford to lose vehicles at a rate that would cripple the Wehrmacht, while simultaneously replacing those losses faster than Germany could inflict them. A German Panzer Grenadier regiment that lost 10 half-tracks in a week of heavy fighting might wait months for replacements. An American Armored Infantry Battalion that lost 10 half-tracks in a day received replacements within 48 hours. This fundamental disparity in production and logistics meant that German forces were fighting a war of attrition they could not win. The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944 demonstrated the full potential of American mechanized infantry. Operation Cobra, the offensive that shattered German defenses in Normandy, unleashed American armored divisions in a war of movement that the Wehrmacht could not match. Half-tracks full of infantry raced across France, covering distances that would have taken leg infantry weeks to traverse. When German forces tried to establish defensive lines, American mechanized infantry enveloped them before positions could be fully prepared. When German armor counterattacked, American infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and fought as conventional infantry, while the vehicles served as mobile fire support platforms with their heavy machine guns. By September 1944, American forces had liberated Paris and were approaching the German border. The rapid advance created massive logistics problems. Fuel and ammunition had to be transported hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches to the front lines. The advance outran supply lines, forcing a temporary halt while logistics caught up. But even this delay worked against Germany, because it gave American forces time to integrate the hundreds of thousands of replacement troops and thousands of replacement vehicles that kept arriving from the United States. The M3 half-tracks kept coming. Production lines in Toledo, Detroit, and other cities had reached peak efficiency. The White Motor Company, Autocar, and Diamond T were churning out vehicles at a combined rate of over 2,000 per month. Including all variants, the M3 personnel carrier, the M16 anti-aircraft version with quad 50 caliber machine guns, the M15 combination gun motor carriage, the various mortar carriers, and self-propelled gun versions American industry was producing over 3,000 half-track variants monthly. German production of the SD-KFZ 251 had peaked in 1944 at about 650 vehicles per month. This was respectable production for a much more complex vehicle, but it was less than one-third the American rate, and German production was declining as Allied strategic bombing disrupted factories and destroyed supply chains. By late 1944, German half-track production had fallen to fewer than 400 per month, and was still dropping. The mathematics of attrition warfare were brutal and inescapable. Even if German vehicles were technically superior, even if German tactics were more sophisticated, the sheer numerical disparity meant that German forces were being ground down in a war they could not sustain. December 1944 brought a desperate German gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was Hitler's last major offensive in the West. 3 German armies, including elite SS panzer divisions, smashed through thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. The attack achieved complete surprise. Weather grounded Allied air support. For the first few days, German forces made alarming progress, threatening to reach the Meuse River and split the Allied armies. But even in this German offensive, the half-track told its story. American reinforcements rushed to the Ardennes, and among them were thousands of half-tracks carrying fresh infantry to plug gaps in the line. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to defend the critical road junction at Bastogne, arrived without their vehicles, but were soon supported by half-track mounted mechanized infantry from surrounding armored divisions. As the weather cleared after Christmas, American air power devastated German supply columns. German armor ran out of fuel. German infantry could not be reinforced because there were no vehicles to move them. Meanwhile, American forces counterattacked with massive material superiority. Half-tracks full of infantry advanced alongside tanks, systematically reducing the German salient. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany had suffered catastrophic losses it could not replace. The Wehrmacht had burned through its last strategic reserves, achieving nothing except to delay the inevitable Allied advance by a few weeks. In the aftermath, American intelligence officers interrogated German prisoners by the thousands. A recurring theme emerged in these interrogations. German soldiers expressed shock at American material abundance. They described American supply lines that seemed limitless, American units that always had fuel and ammunition, American forces that replaced losses overnight. One captured German major, a staff officer who had helped plan defensive operations, told his interrogators about a conversation he had witnessed in late January 1945. A German general, reviewing intelligence reports about American forces massing for a new offensive, had focused on a single detail: the number of half-tracks identified in reconnaissance photographs. "How is it possible?" the general had asked. "They must have lost thousands of these vehicles in the bulge, thousands more in the previous months of fighting. Yet here they are again, more of them than before. Where do they come from?" The staff officer admitted to his American interrogators that no one had an answer. German planners had known intellectually that American production capacity far exceeded their own. But seeing that capacity manifest as an endless tide of replacement vehicles, watching American units absorb losses that would have crippled German formations and then continue operating at full strength, created a psychological impact that went beyond simple military calculation. It was demoralization, not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because they recognized they were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity had become a form of military power that rendered traditional concepts of battlefield superiority nearly meaningless. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. February and March 1945 saw American forces resume their drive toward the Rhine River. This was to be the final barrier, the great defensive line that German propaganda claimed would stop the Allied advance. But by this point, German defenses were hollow. Units existed on paper, but had neither the men nor equipment to hold positions effectively. The Volkssturm, Hitler's last-ditch home guard consisting of boys and old men, tried to defend the Rhineland with small arms against American combined arms teams of tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry. The result was predictable. American forces overran German positions with systematic efficiency. When resistance strengthened at one point, American commanders simply shifted forces to attack elsewhere. The half-tracks gave them the mobility to exploit weakness ruthlessly. By early March, American forces had reached the Rhine along most of its length. The river itself, nearly 1,000 feet wide in places and too deep and swift to ford, seemed like it might slow the American advance. German engineers had destroyed every bridge. Military planners expected it would take weeks to prepare a deliberate river-crossing operation. Then, on March 7, 1945, everything changed. Elements of the 9th Armored Division approached the town of Remagen and discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. German demolition charges had failed to drop the span. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led an assault force across the bridge under fire. Behind his infantry came M3 half-tracks of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, rushing across before German engineers could detonate backup charges. The capture of the Remagen Bridge sent shock waves through both Allied and German commands. For the Allies, it meant a bridgehead across the Rhine, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. For the Germans, it meant the final defensive barrier had been breached. American forces poured across the bridge. Within 24 hours, thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles, including dozens of half-tracks, had crossed. Engineers erected additional bridges nearby. The bridgehead expanded rapidly. But Remagen was just the beginning. General George Patton's Third Army had been racing toward the Rhine further south, and Patton was determined not to let Montgomery's carefully planned Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March, steal the spotlight. On the night of March 22nd, elements of Patton's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim in assault boats. By dawn, they had established a bridgehead. Within hours, engineers had constructed pontoon bridges. The half-tracks started rolling across. Patton famously called Omar Bradley to report the crossing, noting with evident satisfaction that he had beaten Montgomery across the Rhine and done it without the massive aerial bombardment and airborne assault that Montgomery's operation would require. It was vintage Patton, aggressive, opportunistic, and enabled by American material superiority that allowed him to take risks German commanders could never afford. When Montgomery's Operation Plunder launched on March 24th, it was indeed massive. Thousands of artillery pieces fired in support. Waves of transport aircraft dropped paratroopers behind German lines. Naval landing craft, transported overland from the Channel coast, ferried troops across the river. And among the first units across were mechanized infantry in M3 half-tracks, securing the far bank and pushing inland. By the end of March 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points along hundreds of miles of front. German resistance west of the river had collapsed completely, and now the great tide of American mechanized power prepared to flood into the German heartland. The half-tracks that had landed on Normandy beaches 10 months earlier, that had fought through French hedgerows and Belgian forests, that had held during the desperate days of the Bulge, now rolled across pontoon bridges and permanent spans into Germany itself. The image from early April 1945 is seared into historical memory. Columns of American vehicles stretching to the horizon. Tanks, trucks, artillery tractors. And everywhere, half-tracks. M3 personnel carriers loaded with infantry. M16 anti-aircraft vehicles with their distinctive quad 50 caliber gun mounts, M15 combination gun motor carriages, specialized variants carrying mortars, radios, medical supplies. They moved in continuous streams, day and night, pushing deeper into Germany. German civilians watched from the ruins of their towns and cities, stunned by the sheer scale of American mechanized power. German soldiers, those who had not already surrendered or fled, watched with the hollow resignation of men who knew the war was lost. The psychology of this moment deserves examination. For nearly 3 years, German military leadership had maintained certain comfortable assumptions about their enemies. The Americans were industrially powerful, but militarily unsophisticated. American equipment was crude but produced in vast quantities. American soldiers were brave but poorly trained compared to Wehrmacht veterans. Some of these assumptions had contained elements of truth, particularly early in the war. But by spring 1945, those assumptions had become lethal delusions. The Americans rolling across Germany were not the green troops who had stumbled in the Kasserine Pass in early 1943. These were veterans of Normandy, veterans of the Bulge, soldiers who had learned their trade in the hardest school. And their equipment, for all its lack of sophistication, worked. The M3 half-track, dismissed by German engineers as an inferior design, had proven itself across every terrain and climate where Americans fought. More importantly, there were so many of them. A German officer captured in early April 1945, a colonel who had fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts, tried to explain this to his interrogators. "Your technical capabilities I knew," he said. "Your industrial capacity I knew in theory. But to see it manifested, to watch your vehicles come without end, to know that everything we destroy you replace immediately, this is different from knowing the statistics. This is understanding that we cannot win, not because we lack courage or skill, but because you have made the war itself too expensive for us to afford." It was a remarkable admission. The M3 half-track had become more than a vehicle. It had become a symbol of American industrial power, a rolling embodiment of the fundamental disparity that determined the war's outcome. The numbers, when examined comprehensively, tell a story that transcends individual battles or tactical decisions. Between 1941 and 1945, American manufacturers produced approximately 41,000 M3 half-track personnel carriers and related variants. This figure includes roughly 15,000 standard M3 models, with the remainder consisting of specialized versions. The M2 half-track car, the shorter variant used primarily as an artillery tractor, accounted for another 13,500 vehicles. When including all American half-track production, the M3 series, M2 series, M5 series built by International Harvester for Lend-Lease, and all specialized variants, the total approaches 54,000 vehicles. Germany produced approximately 15,250 SDKFZ, 251 half-tracks in all variants between 1939 and 1945. This was respectable production for a more complex vehicle built by a nation fighting a multi-front war while under strategic bombing. But the ratio tells the critical story. For every German half-track, America built more than 3.5, and American production was accelerating even as German production collapsed. In 1944 alone, American factories built over 12,000 half-track variants. That same year, German production peaked at about 7,800, then began its terminal decline as Allied bombing destroyed factories and severed supply chains. But raw production numbers only tell part of the story. The real disparity lay in logistics and sustainability. An American armored division in Germany in April 1945 that lost 20 half-tracks in a week of heavy fighting would receive replacements within days. Replacement vehicles shipped from the United States, crossing the Atlantic in convoy, offloading at French or Belgian ports, and moving forward on the Red Ball Express or other supply routes. The system was not perfect. Delays occurred. Supplies sometimes piled up at ports, while frontline units waited. But the fundamental reality remained. American forces could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. A German panzer division that lost 20 half-tracks faced a completely different reality. Replacement vehicles had to come from dwindling production that was already insufficient to meet demand. Even if vehicles were available, getting them to the front required fuel that Germany increasingly lacked and transportation infrastructure that Allied bombing had systematically destroyed. By spring 1945, many German mechanized units existed only on paper. Their organizational charts showed full strength. Reality showed empty motor pools and infantry marching on foot because no vehicles remained. The German officers watching American columns roll into Germany understood this disparity viscerally. One captured Wehrmacht logistics officer, interviewed in April 1945, provided a detailed analysis that revealed just how thoroughly German planners had miscalculated American capabilities. "We knew the Americans could produce vehicles in large numbers," he explained. "This was not a surprise. But we assumed that such rapid production must create reliability problems. We assumed vehicles would break down frequently. We assumed spare parts would be scarce. We assumed American maintenance capabilities could not keep pace with their production." He paused, searching for words. "We were wrong about everything. Their vehicles are simple, yes, but this simplicity makes them reliable. When they do break down, any mechanic can repair them with basic tools. And they have spare parts for everything. Mountains of spare parts. They discard damaged vehicles and replace them rather than repair them because they have so many vehicles that repair is not worth the effort." This philosophy represented a fundamental difference in approach. German military doctrine emphasized careful maintenance and repair. A damaged vehicle received multiple repairs and overhauls, keeping it operational for years, but often with degraded performance. This made sense for an army that could not replace vehicles easily. American doctrine emphasized rapid field repairs with extensive spare parts, stocks, and replacement of vehicles damaged beyond quick repair. This approach required enormous supply chains but resulted in consistently high operational readiness rates. An American armored division typically kept 90% or more of its vehicles operational. A German panzer division in late 1944 was fortunate to keep 70% operational, and by 1945 that figure had dropped below 50% in many units. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority manifested in various ways. Some German soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing the war was lost but determined to defend their homeland. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, recognizing that continued resistance was pointless. Many fell into a state between these extremes, going through the motions of combat while waiting for the inevitable end. American intelligence officers documented numerous cases of German prisoners expressing not anger or defiance, but a kind of exhausted resignation. "You have too much of everything," one German sergeant told his captors. "Too many tanks, too many planes, too many of these half-tracks. How are we supposed to fight against too much?" The final weeks of the war in Europe saw American mechanized forces ranging across Germany with minimal organized resistance. The half-tracks that carried infantry through French villages in summer 1944 now carried them through German cities in spring 1945. When American forces liberated concentration camps, half-tracks brought medics and supplies to help survivors. When American units raced to cut off retreating German forces, half-tracks gave them the mobility to complete encirclements. When American troops finally linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River in late April, among the vehicles in those historic meetings were M3 half-tracks that had crossed the Atlantic, landed at Normandy, fought through France and Belgium, crossed the Rhine, and driven deep into the heart of Germany. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the aftermath, American forces occupied large portions of Germany and Austria. The half-tracks that had served as battle taxis now served as occupation vehicles, transporting military government personnel, patrolling roads, and maintaining order. Many remained in service for months or years after the war ended. Some were transferred to Allied nations as military aid. Others were gradually phased out as more specialized vehicles became available. But their impact on the war's outcome was undeniable. The German officers who had laughed at American half-tracks in early intelligence reports now had years to reflect on their miscalculation. In prisoner of war camps and during interrogations, many admitted that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern industrial warfare. They had focused on technical specifications, armor thickness, suspension complexity, engine sophistication, while missing the crucial factor of production capacity and logistics. A superior individual weapon system meant nothing if you could not produce enough of them to matter. A technically sophisticated vehicle was a liability if it required specialized maintenance that could not be provided in the field. Mass production of adequate equipment, supported by comprehensive logistics, proved decisively superior to limited production of excellent equipment supported by inadequate logistics. This lesson extended far beyond half-tracks. It applied to every category of military equipment. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther often had superior armor and firepower compared to American Shermans. But America built 50,000 Shermans. Germany built about 1,900 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers. The numerical disparity overwhelmed technical superiority. German fighter aircraft often had better performance than their American counterparts. But American factories built over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany built about 113,000. Again, the numbers told the story. The German Mauser rifle was arguably superior to the American M1 Garand in some respects. But America equipped its entire infantry with semi-automatic rifles, while German infantry primarily used bolt-action weapons. Superior logistics enabled superior equipment distribution. The M3 half-track epitomized this American approach. It was not the best possible half-track design. The German SD-KFC 251 was in many ways superior. But the M3 was good enough, and America built it in overwhelming quantities with logistics to support it anywhere American forces fought. That combination of adequate technology, massive production, and comprehensive logistics support proved to be a war-winning formula. The post-war analysis by military historians and strategists repeatedly returned to this theme. Wars between industrial nations were decided less by the quality of individual weapons than by industrial capacity and logistics systems. The nation that could produce more equipment, deliver it to the battlefield, keep it operational, and replace losses would defeat the nation with better equipment but less capacity to produce and sustain it. The half-track's influence extended into the post-war period in unexpected ways. Dozens of nations operated American half-tracks for decades after World War II. Israel received large numbers of M3 half-tracks and modified them extensively, creating variants that served into the late 20th century. The Israeli Defense Forces recognized the value of mechanized infantry and built their armored doctrine around the concept that American half-tracks had proven in World War II. Other nations, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and various South American countries, operated American half-tracks well into the 1950s and 60s. Some remained in service into the 1970s, a testament to their robust basic design. The concept of the half-track as an armoured personnel carrier eventually gave way to fully tracked and fully wheeled vehicles that offered better protection or performance. But the fundamental idea, mechanized infantry that could keep pace with tanks and fight from their vehicles if necessary, became standard military doctrine worldwide. Modern infantry fighting vehicles like the American Bradley, the Soviet BMP series, and various European designs all trace their conceptual lineage to the half-tracks that proved the value of mechanized infantry in World War II. Even today, over 80 years after the M3 entered production, military planners study the lessons of World War II mechanized operations. The half-track campaigns across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany remain textbook examples of how to integrate infantry with armour, how to resire, exploit mobility for operational advantage, and how to sustain mechanized forces over extended campaigns. The German officers who dismissed American half-tracks in 1942 had learned their lesson by 1945, but the lesson came too late. By the time German planners recognized that American industrial capacity was itself a form of military power, Germany lacked the resources to respond effectively. The Wehrmacht could not suddenly quadruple its half-track production when German factories were being bombed around the clock and fuel supplies had dwindled to critical levels. German forces could not abandon their complex vehicles and adopt simpler designs when such a transition would have disrupted production even further. By 1945, Germany was locked into a logistics death spiral. Losses exceeded production. Production fell as resources dwindled. Resources dwindled because Allied advances cut off supplies. And so on, in a feedback loop that ended only with surrender. The mathematical inevitability of this outcome should have been apparent earlier. By late 1942, informed German analysts understood that American production capacity far exceeded their own. But understanding intellectually that your enemy can produce more equipment differs from experiencing the reality of that production manifested as an endless stream of vehicles, aircraft, and supplies that never stops coming. The German colonel, watching American half-tracks roll past in March 1945, had known the statistics. But statistics became personal when he watched vehicle after vehicle pass, column after column, hour after hour, and realized that what he was seeing represented only a tiny fraction of American mechanized power. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.